What drives a queen to choose death over surrender? Was it pride, fear, or a final act of power? Cleopatra, the last pharaoh of Egypt, lived a life of immense power, seduction, and ambition. But as the shadow of Rome crept closer, she faced the greatest decision of her reign. Welcome to Spellbound Stories, where every Thursday, we dive into the lives and legends of history's most fascinating figures. Today, we unravel the mystery behind Cleopatra's final act, her choice to embrace death on her own terms, with a serpent's bite. Make sure to subscribe and join us on this journey through history's darkest and most captivating tales. Chapter 1. Daughter of the Nile. The night was still. The heavy air of Alexandria draped over the city like a silken veil. A crescent moon hung low in the sky, casting a pale glow over the waters of the Nile, whose dark currents whispered secrets from distant lands. In the palace, nestled deep within the heart of Egypt's ancient capital, a young girl stood by the window, her gaze fixed on the river that had been the lifeblood of her people for millennia. She was Cleopatra, daughter of Ptolemy XII, and though she was young, there was something in her eyes that hinted at an understanding far beyond her years. Cleopatra had learned from an early age that the world was not kind to the weak. She had watched her father, a man who wore the crown of Egypt yet knelt before Rome, struggle to maintain control over a kingdom slipping through his fingers. She had seen the fear in his eyes, heard the whispers of betrayal in the court, and understood that survival in Alexandria's royal palace required more than just the blood of pharaohs in one's veins. It demanded cunning, intelligence, and the ability to see the world not as it should be, but as it was. A place where trust was a luxury, and power was the only thing that mattered. Her father, Ptolemy XII, known as Auletes, had not been a strong ruler. He had spent his reign balancing on the edge of a knife, constantly appeasing the Romans, selling pieces of Egypt's future in exchange for his present security. The people of Alexandria whispered of his weaknesses, of the shame he brought upon Egypt by allowing foreign powers to dictate the course of their ancient land. Cleopatra heard these whispers too, and though she was still a child, she felt the sting of their truth. Her father, once a symbol of power and majesty, had become a puppet, and she knew that the throne she would one day inherit was surrounded by enemies, both seen and unseen. As a child, Cleopatra was often left alone, her father too consumed by matters of state, or too fearful of those closest to him, to offer more than a distant presence in her life. But solitude did not mean loneliness. Cleopatra thrived in the silence of her chambers, where she devoured the scrolls and texts of her tutors, learning the languages of foreign lands, the art of statecraft, and the histories of those who had come before her. She was particularly drawn to the stories of the great queens who had ruled Egypt in the past, Hatshepsut, Nefertiti, and the fierce warrior pharaohs whose reigns were marked by strength and sovereignty. Cleopatra dreamed of becoming their equal, not merely a ruler in name, but one whose presence would echo through the ages. But beneath her ambition, there was fear. The palace was a gilded cage, and within its walls, treachery festered like an open wound. Cleopatra had seen her siblings, her brothers and sisters, eye each other not as family, but as rivals. Her brother, Ptolemy XIII, barely older than she, had already begun to align himself with the palace conspirators, whispering of power and control, while her sister Arsinoe's ambitions were even darker. The Ptolemaic dynasty, once a symbol of unity, was now fractured, and Cleopatra understood that the blood that ran through her veins made her as much a target as a ruler in waiting. It was in the quiet moments, in the hidden corridors of the palace, that Cleopatra felt the weight of destiny settle upon her small shoulders. She knew she was different, not just in her intellect or her beauty, which even at a young age drew admiration, but in her understanding of the game being played around her. The court was a place of whispers, where alliances shifted like the sands of the desert, and loyalty was as fleeting as a summer breeze. To survive here, to rise above the petty ambitions of her siblings and the foreign threats that loomed over Egypt, Cleopatra would need to be more than just her father's daughter. She would need to become the serpent in the grass, the shadow in the halls, and the voice that whispered in the ears of kings and emperors alike. One evening, as Cleopatra wandered the palace gardens, she overheard two of her father's advisors in deep conversation. Their voices were low, conspiratorial, but Cleopatra had long learned the art of listening without being seen. They spoke of the Romans, of the growing tension between the Senate and her father, of debts owed and the danger of an uprising in Alexandria. "The people grow restless," one of them said, his voice thick with fear. "They speak of rebellion, of a new order. If Rome does not intervene, it may be too late to save the throne." Cleopatra felt a chill run down her spine. She knew, even then, that the fate of Egypt was tied to Rome, that the golden eagle of the Republic hovered above her father's throne like a vulture waiting for the kill. She also knew that Rome could not be trusted. They were hungry, their empire expanding with each passing year, and Egypt, with its wealth and its history, was a prize they would not let slip through their grasp. Her father's strategy of appeasement would not hold forever. The thought of it made her both furious and determined. She would not be a queen who bowed to foreign masters. In the years that followed, Cleopatra's resolve only hardened. She watched her father's health decline, saw the cracks in the foundation of his rule grow wider, and knew that her time was coming. The court remained a dangerous place, with each passing day bringing new threats, new plots. Cleopatra, however, had learned to navigate this treacherous world. She smiled when she needed to, charmed when it was required, but behind her dark eyes, there was always calculation. She was her father's daughter, but she would not share his fate. She would not be a ruler consumed by fear or subservient to foreign powers. As she stood in the palace overlooking the Nile, watching its waters shimmer in the moonlight, Cleopatra whispered a silent vow to herself. She would take Egypt into her own hands. She would be the ruler that her father could never be, the one who would preserve the throne and keep her enemies at bay, even if it meant sacrificing her soul in the process. For Cleopatra, the Nile was not just the river of life, it was the symbol of her power, a force that flowed through her veins, as ancient and unyielding as the desert itself. She would rise, not as a daughter of a weakened king, but as a queen who would command both love and fear. And when the time came, all of Egypt, all of Rome, would know the name Cleopatra, not as a victim of fate, but as a master of it. The shadows of the palace had taught her well. Chapter 2. The Blood of Betrayal. Ptolemy XII, the flautist king, lay dead. His passing was neither mourned nor celebrated in the streets of Alexandria, but it left a chasm of uncertainty in the palace that loomed like a storm waiting to break. Egypt, once a proud and mighty empire, had been reduced to a chess piece on the board of Rome's ever-growing ambition. And in the heart of this fractured kingdom, Cleopatra stood at the edge of a dangerous precipice, where the blood of her family flowed as thick and treacherous as the Nile itself. Cleopatra had been preparing for this moment for years, anticipating the inevitable vacuum her father's death would leave. Yet even her careful plans could not fully prepare her for the betrayal that would come from those closest to her. Power, she had learned early on, was an unforgiving beast, and its pursuit would demand sacrifices far more painful than the death of any one ruler. Her father's last will had made it clear: Cleopatra would co-rule Egypt with her younger brother, Ptolemy XIII. But even as the ink dried on the papyrus of that decree, Cleopatra knew that the bond of family would soon be broken by ambition. Her brother, still a boy in his early teens, was a pawn in the hands of more cunning players. The true power behind Ptolemy XIII was the cabal of advisors and generals who sought to use him as their puppet. Led by the cunning and ambitious regent Pothinus and the general Achilles, they had no intention of allowing Cleopatra to hold any real authority. To them, she was a threat, intelligent, popular with the people, and too willful to be easily controlled. It did not take long for tensions between Cleopatra and her brother's supporters to surface. At first, there were subtle insults, decisions made without her input, meetings from which she was excluded. But Cleopatra was not one to be quietly sidelined. She confronted Pothinus in the palace chambers, her voice calm but laced with steel. "You may control my brother's actions, but you will never control Egypt," she told him, her gaze unwavering. "I am the rightful queen." Pothinus smiled, a serpent smile, and his eyes glittered with malice. "The throne is not claimed by words, Queen Cleopatra. It is taken by force." The words hung in the air like a curse, and Cleopatra knew then that she was at war. Not only with her brother, but with the entire machinery of power that propped him up. The palace, once her home, had become a den of vipers, where every shadow hid a potential assassin, and every whispered conversation carried the weight of conspiracy. Her brother's court was bloated with opportunists and traitors, and their eyes gleamed with the same ambition that fueled her own. One night, as Cleopatra paced the halls of her chambers, she received a visitor, her sister, Arsinoe. Though they shared blood, there was no warmth between them. Arsinoe had always been an enigma, a quiet figure who lurked in the background, watching as the power struggles unfolded around her. Cleopatra had once dismissed her as weak, a mere observer in the Game of Thrones. But tonight, Arsinoe's face held a different expression, one of smug confidence. "You should leave the city," Arsinoe whispered. "The council is already preparing to remove you from power. They say you're too dangerous, too unpredictable." Cleopatra studied her sister's face, the sly curve of her lips. Arsinoe was not here out of concern. She was here because she too had ambitions. Cleopatra realized then that she was surrounded by traitors, even within her own family. Betrayal was inevitable, a blood pact written in the Ptolemaic line. But Cleopatra was no longer the naive girl who watched her father's slow decline. She had become the Serpent, silent, poised to strike. "I won't be driven out of my kingdom," Cleopatra replied coldly. "Not by the council, not by our brother, and certainly not by you." But Arsinoe's warning was not an idle threat. The betrayal came swiftly. Cleopatra awoke one morning to find her household in chaos. The palace guards, once loyal to her, had been replaced by men loyal to Ptolemy. The streets of Alexandria murmured with rumors that she had been deposed, her rule declared illegitimate by the council. In a brazen act of treachery, Ptolemy XIII's forces moved to exile Cleopatra, forcing her from the palace with little more than the clothes on her back. She fled to the southern deserts, taking refuge with a small but loyal group of followers. The sands of Egypt were her shelter now, but even in exile, Cleopatra's mind was a whirlwind of plans and schemes. She had lost the throne, but not her will to fight. Her brother and his advisors had underestimated her resolve, and Cleopatra knew that her time in the shadows would be brief. From the desert, she sent word to Rome. Julius Caesar, the most powerful man in the Republic, was embroiled in his own wars. But Cleopatra knew that Egypt's wealth and resources would be too tempting for him to ignore. If she could win Caesar to her cause, she could reclaim her throne. And more than that, she could reshape the destiny of Egypt itself. Meanwhile, back in Alexandria, Ptolemy XIII reveled in his victory, blind to the storm brewing just beyond the horizon. Arsinoe too began to position herself, sensing that her moment might come soon enough. The palace became a pit of deceit, with every player angling for their own slice of power. Yet all of them failed to see the larger game at play, the one that Cleopatra had already set in motion. It was not long before Julius Caesar arrived in Egypt, under the guise of settling a dispute between Ptolemy XIII and Cleopatra. But Cleopatra had no intention of pleading her case in front of the Roman leader as a deposed queen. She made her entrance in the most daring way imaginable, smuggled into Caesar's chambers, wrapped in a rug that her servants unrolled at his feet. The spectacle of it, combined with her undeniable charm and intellect, captivated the Roman general. Cleopatra was not a woman who begged for power. She commanded it. In Caesar, she saw not only an ally, but a man who could help her change the course of history. and Caesar, enthralled by her presence, soon aligned himself with her cause. Together, they devised a plan to bring down Ptolemy XIII's regime and restore Cleopatra to her rightful place on the throne. The streets of Alexandria became a battlefield as Caesar's legions clashed with Ptolemy's forces. Fire raged through the city, and the once grand library of Alexandria was reduced to ashes. Ptolemy XIII, realizing too late that he had been outmaneuvered, attempted to flee but drowned in the Nile's dark waters, his ambitions swallowed by the very river that had sustained his kingdom for centuries. In the aftermath of the battle, Cleopatra stood once more in the palace she had been forced to abandon. The blood of her brother had been spilled, and her sister, Arsinoe, was captured and paraded through the streets of Rome as a trophy. Cleopatra had secured her place as the sole ruler of Egypt, but the cost had been steep. The blood of betrayal ran deep, staining the very stones of the palace beneath her feet. Yet as Cleopatra ascended to the throne, there was no triumph in her heart. Only the cold understanding that power, once taken, demanded constant vigilance. The game had only just begun, and she knew that betrayal, like a serpent, would always be coiled just out of sight. In the end, Cleopatra had survived. But in the blood-soaked halls of the Ptolemaic dynasty, survival came at a price, and the queen knew that the blood of betrayal would forever stain her reign. Chapter 3. The Seduction of Power. The sea breeze swept through Alexandria's streets, carrying with it the salty tang of the Mediterranean and the murmur of whispers that followed Julius Caesar wherever he went. His arrival in Egypt was not by choice, but necessity. Rome, with all its strength, had been torn asunder by civil war, and Caesar had come to this ancient land not to meddle in its politics, but to collect on Rome's debts. Yet in the labyrinthine corridors of Egyptian power, he would find a queen who could alter his destiny as profoundly as he would hers. Cleopatra watched from afar as Caesar entered Alexandria, his presence radiating an authority that few could match. She knew that this was her moment, the turning point she had waited for ever since her exile into the desert. Her brother, Ptolemy XIII, had managed to control Egypt's throne with the help of corrupt advisors and a loyal military, but his grasp on power was weak. Rome had the might to tilt the scales in her favor, but only if she could weave herself into Caesar's ambitions. Cleopatra was no stranger to the art of seduction, but it was not her beauty that she relied on. She understood that power did not bend for mere flesh and charm. It bowed to intellect, manipulation, and the ability to see through the masks of others. Julius Caesar was a man who had conquered lands, crushed enemies, and shaped the fate of empires. He would not be easily swayed by a woman, even one as formidable as Cleopatra. But where others saw only a general and a politician, Cleopatra saw a man with desires, weaknesses, and, above all, an insatiable hunger for power. With careful planning, Cleopatra staged her dramatic entrance. Smuggled into Caesar's chambers wrapped in a rug, her servants unfurled her at his feet, a spectacle both audacious and calculated. The sight of the young queen, disheveled from her journey yet regal in her bearing, captivated the Roman leader immediately. Cleopatra's first impression was not of desperation, but of boldness. She understood that to stand beside a man like Caesar, she could not beg for his aid. She had to appear as his equal, a queen in her own right. From the moment their eyes met, Cleopatra knew she had him. Caesar, for all his cunning, was drawn to her like a moth to flame. The stories of her beauty were not exaggerated, but what truly fascinated him was her mind, sharp, quick, and calculating. She spoke to him not as a supplicant, but as a partner in power. Cleopatra laid out her case. The rightful queen of Egypt, stripped of her throne by a usurping brother and his treacherous counsel, offering Rome an alliance that would secure both Caesar's interests and her own. But Cleopatra did not rely solely on logic or promises. She knew that men like Caesar thrived on something more primal, the allure of control, the intoxication of conquest, and the thrill of a woman who was just beyond their grasp. In their private conversations, Cleopatra played the role of the queen who understood his struggles, who could speak to him in the language of empires and strategy, but who also knew the art of tantalizing restraint. She was never fully his. She remained just out of reach, keeping him chasing the idea of what they could become together. In those intimate moments, Cleopatra and Caesar discussed more than politics. They spoke of the gods, of fate, and the inevitable fall of kingdoms. Cleopatra likened herself to Isis, the goddess of life and magic, and suggested that Caesar too was more than a man. He was destined to be a god among mortals. She appealed to his vanity, feeding his grandiose vision of himself as the ruler not just of Rome, but of the world. Together, they could rule two empires, Rome and Egypt, united by their ambition, their power, and their shared legacy. But beneath Cleopatra's flattery was a razor-sharp mind, calculating every word, every gesture. She knew that Caesar's favor would not come without a price, and she was willing to pay it, so long as it secured her throne. Cleopatra was not in love with Caesar. She was in love with power. Every night they spent together was a step closer to reclaiming her kingdom, and she could feel the reins of control slipping back into her hands. To Caesar, she was a lover, an ally, and perhaps even a future empress. To Cleopatra, he was a tool, one that she would use to carve her name into the history of Egypt. The political situation in Alexandria quickly shifted. Cleopatra's reappearance, alongside the might of Caesar's legions, sent shockwaves through Ptolemy XIII's court. The young king, barely more than a puppet of his advisors, found himself on the defensive. His forces were no match for Caesar's seasoned soldiers, and with the Roman general's support, Cleopatra's claim to the throne gained legitimacy. But the true battle was fought not on the battlefield, but in the quiet chambers where Cleopatra and Caesar plotted their future. As their relationship deepened, Cleopatra began to manipulate Caesar's ambitions. She spoke of Rome's hunger for Egypt's wealth, of how an alliance with her would open the doors to untold riches. But she also made it clear that Egypt would not be a mere vassal. Under her rule, Egypt would stand as a proud and independent kingdom, but one that was loyal to Rome, so long as Rome respected her sovereignty. Cleopatra deftly balanced the line between subservience and independence, knowing that Caesar's ultimate loyalty was to his empire, but appealing to his desire for something greater than Rome alone could offer. For Caesar, Cleopatra became not just a queen to be restored, but a partner in his own grand narrative. She was the embodiment of the exotic East, the jewel of the Nile, a living goddess who could enhance his own legend. Together, they would create a new world, one where their names would be spoken in the same breath as the gods. And yet, despite his growing obsession with her, Caesar never realized how carefully Cleopatra had been pulling the strings all along. The fall of Ptolemy XIII was inevitable. With Caesar's forces at her back, Cleopatra returned to Alexandria in triumph, her brother drowning in the Nile as he attempted to flee the city. The boy king who had once dared to challenge her was dead, his body lost to the very river that had sustained Egypt for millennia. Cleopatra, now the undisputed ruler, stood at the palace balcony overlooking the city, her heart as cold and unyielding as the stone beneath her feet. Beside her stood Caesar, victorious, but unaware of just how deeply Cleopatra had woven herself into his fate. She had reclaimed her throne, not through brute force, but through the careful, deliberate manipulation of a man who believed himself her equal. Cleopatra had seduced him, not with love, but with power, the one force that truly drove them both. As the days passed, their bond grew more complex. Caesar, ever the conqueror, believed he had won Egypt through his military might. But Cleopatra knew the truth. It was she who had conquered Caesar, not with armies, but with words, promises, and the dark seduction of ambition. The power dynamic between them was a delicate balance, one that Cleopatra maintained with ruthless precision. She knew that Caesar's affections would not last forever, and when the time came, she would need to pivot, to find new ways to keep herself at the center of power. But for now, Cleopatra allowed Caesar to bask in their shared triumph. She knew that her future was secure, at least for the moment. With Rome at her back and Egypt under her control, Cleopatra's reign had only just begun. Yet even in victory, she remained ever watchful, ever calculating, knowing that the seduction of power was a dangerous game, one that could turn against her as easily as it had worked in her favor. In the quiet of her chambers, Cleopatra smiled to herself. She had played her part perfectly, drawing Caesar into her web of ambition, and in doing so, she had secured her legacy. But the game was not over. It would never be over, not until she ruled the world, not until her name was spoken in reverence and fear by all who dared to challenge her. For Cleopatra, the seduction of power was more than a means to an end. It was her destiny. Chapter 4. The Empire's Shadow. The sun set over Alexandria, casting long shadows across the palace, and with it, a deep unease settled over Cleopatra's mind. She stood on the balcony, overlooking the bustling city, its streets alive with the hum of commerce, culture, and power. The Nile glimmered beneath the fading light, a river that had given Egypt life for centuries. But now, to Cleopatra, it felt like a dividing line between the land she ruled and the empire that loomed just beyond her reach. Rome was always there, an ever-present force, a shadow that darkened her reign with every passing day. Cleopatra had reclaimed her throne, but victory had come with a cost. Her alliance with Julius Caesar had secured her rule, but it had also bound Egypt's fate to Rome's ambitions. As she solidified her position as queen, she began to realize the true weight of that bond. Caesar, though an ally, had never truly seen Egypt as an equal power. To him, Egypt was a jewel to be admired, a prize to be controlled. And while Cleopatra had manipulated Caesar to serve her own ends, she knew that Rome's appetite for conquest was insatiable. Even now, with Caesar gone, murdered in the streets of Rome, the shadow of the empire remained. His death had only deepened her fear. Rome was in chaos, its leaders torn apart by civil war and political intrigue. But Cleopatra understood that out of this chaos, a new order would emerge, one that could either crush her or lift her higher, depending on how she played the game. The question that haunted her was simple. How long could she keep Egypt's independence intact before Rome swallowed it whole? She could feel the tendrils of Roman ambition reaching across the Mediterranean, seeking to control every corner of the known world. And though she was Queen of Egypt, a ruler in her own right, Cleopatra knew that her kingdom's survival depended on how well she could balance the desires of those who now held Rome's power in their hands. Mark Antony had risen in Caesar's place, and with him came new opportunities, but also new dangers. He was a man of war, a soldier who had fought by Caesar's side and now sought to carve out his own empire. But unlike Caesar, Antony was reckless, driven by passion as much as by ambition. Cleopatra had met him once before, years earlier, when she was still a girl learning the art of court intrigue. Even then, she had sensed his hunger for power, his need to prove himself greater than those who came before him. Now, Cleopatra would need to decide whether to align herself with Antony, to tether Egypt's fate to yet another Roman general, or to seek a path that would keep her kingdom independent. The thought of further entangling herself with Rome was suffocating, but Cleopatra knew that without powerful allies, Egypt was vulnerable. Rome would not let her rule in peace forever. It was only a matter of time before they turned their gaze back toward the Nile. The council in Alexandria was divided. Some urged Cleopatra to fortify the kingdom, to strengthen their military, and prepare for the inevitable conflict with Rome. Others, more cautious, advised diplomacy, urging her to placate the Roman leaders and maintain the fragile peace. But Cleopatra could not shake the feeling that no matter what path she chose, Rome would eventually come for her throne. The empire's shadow was too vast, too hungry. In the dead of night, Cleopatra's paranoia began to fester. She could feel the walls of the palace closing in around her, the sense that she was being watched, judged, even betrayed by those she trusted most. The whispers in the court grew louder, rumors of disloyalty, of factions forming behind her back. Her enemies, both in Egypt and in Rome, were circling like vultures, waiting for her to make a mistake. The death of her sister, Arsinoe, had left a bitter taste in her mouth. Though Cleopatra had orchestrated her downfall, ensuring that her rival would never again threaten her rule, the victory felt hollow. Blood had been spilled, and the scent of betrayal lingered in the air. Even her closest allies could not be trusted entirely. The Ptolemaic dynasty had always been one of treachery and murder, and Cleopatra knew that her reign was no different. Power was held by those who were willing to kill for it, and she had proven that she was willing to do whatever it took to keep her crown. But as the days wore on, Cleopatra's fear shifted from internal threats to the larger menace looming across the sea. The triumvirate that now ruled Rome, Antony, Octavian, and Lepidus, was unstable, a powder keg waiting to explode. Cleopatra had to tread carefully. She knew that Antony's growing power would eventually put him at odds with Octavian, Caesar's adopted heir. And when that conflict came, she would need to choose a side. Antony arrived in Egypt with the pomp and splendor befitting a Roman general. His ships filled the harbors of Alexandria, and his soldiers marched through the streets as if they were already in a conquered land. But Cleopatra was not so easily intimidated. She received Antony in her palace with all the majesty of a goddess queen, draped in silks and jewels that shimmered in the flickering torchlight. She was determined to make him see her not as a mere queen, but as an equal, a ruler whose power could match his own. Their first meeting was charged with tension. Antony was captivated by Cleopatra's presence, just as Caesar had been. But there was something different in the air this time. Cleopatra did not rely on seduction alone. She knew Antony respected strength above all else, and she presented herself not as a lover, but as a partner in power. Their conversations were laced with politics, strategy, and the looming threat of Octavian. "You need me," Cleopatra said, her voice soft but unwavering. "As much as I need you. Together we can shape the world." Antony, for all his bravado, understood the truth of her words. Rome was divided, and his claim to power was fragile. Cleopatra's wealth, her army, and her control of the Nile were invaluable assets. But even as they forged their alliance, Cleopatra could feel the weight of Rome pressing down on her. She had secured Antony's loyalty, for now, but the empire was vast, and its ambitions were boundless. The months passed, and Cleopatra's paranoia grew. She had tethered herself to Antony, but what would happen when Octavian moved against him? Would Antony be strong enough to withstand the onslaught of Rome's full might, or would he crumble as Ptolemy had before him? The thought kept her awake at night, the shadows in her chamber seeming to stretch and twist, mocking her. Egypt's fate was now intertwined with Antony's, and if he fell, so too would her kingdom. Cleopatra knew she needed to act, to consolidate her power before it was too late. She tightened her grip on Alexandria, rooting out potential traitors within her court, silencing dissent, and ensuring that Egypt remained a fortress against the coming storm. She sent emissaries to distant lands, forging secret alliances, gathering intelligence on Rome's movements. Every decision was calculated, every action designed to secure her place on the throne. But the shadow of Rome remained, dark and all-encompassing, growing closer with each passing day. In the quiet moments, when Cleopatra was alone in her chambers, she wondered if there was any escape from Rome's grasp. Could Egypt ever truly be free of the empire's influence? Or was her reign, like the Nile itself, destined to flow inexorably toward the Roman tide? She had played the game of power with skill and ruthlessness, but the rules were changing, and the stakes were higher than ever. As Cleopatra gazed out over the city, the empire's shadow stretched long over her kingdom, a constant reminder that her greatest enemy was not within Egypt, but across the sea. Rome was coming, and when it did, Cleopatra would be ready. She would fight with every ounce of her strength, every resource at her disposal, to keep her throne, her kingdom, and her legacy intact. But in the deepest corners of her mind, Cleopatra knew that even the brightest flames eventually flickered and died in the face of the coming darkness. Chapter 5. The Queen and the General. The first time Cleopatra and Mark Antony stood side by side on the grand balcony of the palace, they looked out over Alexandria as if they already ruled the world. Together, they were a force of nature. Cleopatra, the enigmatic Queen of Egypt, and Antony, the fearless Roman general who commanded legions. Their union was one of fire and fury, a powerful collision of passion and ambition, where love and strategy intertwined so tightly that it became impossible to tell where one ended and the other began. Antony was unlike any man Cleopatra had ever known. He was bold, brash, and ruled not by cold calculation, but by raw emotion. Where Julius Caesar had been measured and methodical, Antony was impulsive, driven by instinct and desire. Cleopatra saw in him both a lover and a weapon, a man who could help her defend Egypt against Rome's looming might and secure her legacy. Yet she also knew that his flaws, his arrogance, his recklessness, would one day be his undoing. Their relationship began in the heat of political necessity. Cleopatra needed Antony's protection, and Antony needed Cleopatra's wealth. But as they spent more time together, the line between alliance and love blurred. In the halls of the palace, they plotted their future together, how they would defeat Octavian, Caesar's cold and calculating heir, and rise to power over both Egypt and Rome. Yet in the private chambers of the Queen, they spoke of love, of the stars above the Nile, and of a future where they ruled not just two lands, but an empire of their own making. Their nights were filled with lavish feasts and whispered promises, Antony's laughter echoing through the palace halls as Cleopatra's eyes gleamed with both affection and ambition. She had found in him a partner who could match her fire, who shared her hunger for greatness. But even in those moments of intimacy, Cleopatra never lost sight of the stakes. Egypt's future, her throne, and her son's inheritance all depended on Antony's success. She could not afford to love him blindly. Yet Antony, for all his strength, was slipping. The Roman general who had once been feared by enemies across the empire was beginning to show cracks. His campaigns in Parthia had been disastrous, his forces routed, and his reputation tarnished. The whispers of his failure spread across Rome, carried by the winds of Alexandria, where Cleopatra listened with growing concern. She watched as Antony drank more, as his temper flared, and as the weight of his defeats began to drag him down. He was no longer the indomitable warrior she had first met. The fire that had once fueled him now seemed to be consuming him from within. Cleopatra's court was becoming a reflection of their strained relationship, a once thriving center of power and opulence, now marked by tension and uncertainty. The people of Alexandria adored Cleopatra, but they were wary of Antony. They saw him not as a hero, but as a foreigner, a man whose failures could bring ruin to their kingdom. And Cleopatra, though still beloved, was becoming more isolated, trapped between her loyalty to Antony and her duty to protect Egypt. Octavian, ever the tactician, seized upon Antony's weaknesses. From Rome, he launched a campaign to undermine Antony's authority, spreading rumors of his decadence in Egypt, of how he had abandoned his Roman wife, Octavia, for the seductive Queen of the Nile. Antony's enemies in the Senate painted Cleopatra as a temptress who had bewitched him, turning him against Rome itself. They spoke of the couple's extravagance, of their grand feasts and decadent lifestyle, as proof that Antony had forsaken his Roman heritage. But the real danger lay not in gossip, but in the legions that Octavian was amassing. War was coming. Cleopatra and Antony knew it, felt it in the air like a storm gathering on the horizon. They clung to each other in those final months, desperate to hold on to both their love and their crumbling power. But even as they made plans, preparing their armies, Cleopatra could see the fear in Antony's eyes. He was no longer the invincible general who had once marched across the world. He was a man haunted by the ghosts of his past, his failures looming larger with each passing day. the Battle of Actium would be their final stand. Antony, determined to reclaim his honor, gathered his forces to face Octavian's navy. Cleopatra, ever by his side, brought Egypt's ships into the fray, her presence a reminder that this was not just Antony's fight, it was hers as well. But the battle was a disaster. Antony's forces were outmaneuvered, outmatched. As the smoke of burning ships filled the air and the waters of the Ionian Sea churned with the bodies of the dead, Antony and Cleopatra were forced to retreat. Chapter 6. The Battle of Actium. The sun hung low over the Ionian Sea, casting a blood-red glow over the horizon. Cleopatra stood aboard her flagship, the wind tugging at the hem of her royal robes, her dark eyes fixed on the gathering forces ahead. The tension was palpable, a silence thick with the weight of fate. Surrounding her, the mighty Egyptian fleet, hundreds of ships strong, gleamed in the fading light. Beyond them, the ships of Mark Antony, a formidable Roman fleet poised for battle. Yet, as the waves gently lapped against the hulls, Cleopatra could feel the future slipping through her fingers. The Battle of Actium had been a long time coming. The war between Antony and Octavian was no longer just a struggle for control of Rome. It had become a fight for survival for both Antony and Cleopatra. They had gambled everything, land, wealth, and their very lives, on this final confrontation. Victory here meant securing Egypt's independence and perhaps even domination over Rome. Defeat, however, meant ruin. And for the first time in Cleopatra's life, she could feel the tightening grip of dread closing around her. Cleopatra's once unshakable confidence had begun to waver in the days leading up to the battle. She had seen the cracks in Antony's once mighty command, watched as his strategies faltered, and his once loyal generals began to question him. She had sensed the growing distance between them, a gulf that had widened since Antony's failures in Parthia and his subsequent retreat into indulgence and despair. He was not the man she had first allied herself with, and that terrified her. Still, Cleopatra had no choice but to stand with him. Her own fleet, the pride of Egypt, had been positioned in support of Antony's forces. She had invested everything into this alliance, her fortunes now irrevocably tied to his. Yet, as she scanned the horizon, watching the vast armada of Octavian's forces assembling on the opposite side of the sea, Cleopatra felt the weight of an impending doom that she could not escape. The morning of the battle dawned, cold and bleak. Octavian's navy, commanded by the ruthless Admiral Agrippa, was superior in both number and tactics. His ships, sleek and fast, maneuvered with precision, while Antony's forces, burdened by heavy war galleys, struggled to maintain their formation. Cleopatra's fleet was positioned at the rear, a strategic decision meant to give her a chance to escape should the tide of battle turn against them. She had prepared for every outcome, but nothing could prepare her for the crushing reality that was to come. The clash began with the sound of horns and the crash of oars cutting through the water. The first ships collided with thunderous force, and soon the sea was alive with fire, smoke, and the screams of dying men. Cleopatra watched from a distance as Antony's forces engaged Octavian's fleet, her heart pounding with each blow. The battle unfolded in chaos, ships ramming into one another, men leaping from burning decks into the sea, only to be pulled under by the weight of their armor. Cleopatra's eyes darted across the water, searching for Antony's flagship. He was there, in the thick of it, leading his men as he always had. But she could see it, the hesitation in his movements, the cracks in his once unshakable confidence. The Roman legions were masters of war, and even Antony's formidable reputation was not enough to turn the tide in his favor. Cleopatra's fleet remained on the fringes, waiting for a signal from Antony that would decide their next move. But the signal never came. As the hours dragged on, it became clear that the battle was slipping out of their control. Octavian's forces, led by Agrippa, had outmaneuvered them. The Egyptian fleet was isolated, cut off from Antony's ships by Agrippa's aggressive tactics. Panic began to spread among the Egyptian commanders. Cleopatra could feel it too, an overwhelming sense that the battle was lost before it had even truly begun. And then, at the height of the battle, Antony's resolve crumbled. Cleopatra saw it unfold as if in slow motion. Antony's flagship, caught between the advancing enemy ships, faltered. Instead of rallying his forces, instead of fighting to the bitter end as he had always sworn he would, Antony ordered a retreat. Cleopatra's breath caught in her throat. This was not the Antony she had known, the man of iron will and boundless ambition. This was a man broken by defeat, overwhelmed by the relentless onslaught of failure and loss. As Antony's ships began to pull back, Cleopatra's mind raced. She knew what had to be done. The battle was lost. If she remained, her fleet would be decimated, and with it, any hope of survival. She had no choice but to flee. Cleopatra gave the signal, and her ships one by one began to withdraw from the battlefield. The sight of the Queen's flagship retreating sent a shockwave through the remaining forces, and soon Antony's men, seeing their last hope slipping away, followed suit in disarray. The retreat was chaotic, a desperate scramble for survival. Cleopatra's fleet sailed for Egypt as fast as the winds would carry them, but the weight of defeat clung to them like a shroud. As the shores of Alexandria came into view, Cleopatra stood on the deck of her ship, staring out at the city that had once felt like the center of the world. Now, it felt small, insignificant, a fragile jewel that could be crushed by Rome's iron grip at any moment. Back in Alexandria, Cleopatra's court had already begun to crumble. The news of their defeat spread quickly, and with it came the whispers of betrayal and abandonment. Cleopatra could feel her power slipping through her hands. Once she had been untouchable, the living embodiment of Isis, the goddess queen who commanded both love and fear. Now she was a ruler on the edge of ruin, her kingdom crumbling beneath her feet. Antony returned to Alexandria not as a conqueror, but as a man utterly defeated. The sight of him, once a mighty general, now hollow and broken, was almost too much for Cleopatra to bear. She had loved him, if not with her heart, then with her ambition. But now that ambition had turned to ash. The man who had promised her the world had delivered only failure. They were both trapped, prisoners of their own choices. In the days following the battle, Cleopatra retreated into the solitude of her palace, her mind racing with thoughts of what could have been. She had fought so hard, sacrificed so much to keep Egypt independent, to maintain her throne. But now, with Octavian's forces closing in, she knew that the end was near. The empire's shadow had finally fallen over her kingdom, and there was no escaping it. Despair crept into Cleopatra's once iron resolve. She could feel it in the air, in the way her advisors no longer met her gaze, in the way her people whispered behind her back. Antony, too, had become a ghost of the man he once was, haunted by his failures and by the knowledge that Octavian would show no mercy. The isolation was suffocating. Cleopatra, once surrounded by loyal allies and adoring subjects, was now alone, her empire crumbling around her. She spent long hours in the palace's dimly lit halls, staring out over the city, watching as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting Alexandria into darkness. The once bustling streets seemed quieter now, as if the entire city was holding its breath, waiting for the inevitable. Cleopatra knew that Octavian would come for her, that he would not rest until Egypt was brought to its knees. In those final desperate days, Cleopatra began to make plans. She had always been a survivor, always found a way to turn even the bleakest situation to her advantage. But now, with Antony broken and her forces in tatters, she saw no path forward. Her mind raced with thoughts of escape, of alliances that could still be forged. But the truth was clear. Egypt had fallen, and with it, her dreams of an empire that could rival Rome. As Octavian's legions marched toward Alexandria, Cleopatra felt the weight of history bearing down on her. The once mighty queen, who had stood defiant against the greatest empire the world had ever known, now stood at the edge of ruin. The Battle of Actium had shattered more than just ships. It had shattered her dreams, her power, and the fragile hope she had held onto for so long. In the end, Cleopatra knew there was no escape. The shadow of Rome had finally engulfed her, and all that remained was the question of how she would face the final chapter of her reign. But even in her darkest moments, Cleopatra remained a queen, proud, defiant, and unyielding to the last. Chapter 7. Serpent's Fate. The palace in Alexandria had never felt so empty. Once filled with the sounds of courtly life, with ministers bustling through its marble halls and the laughter of Cleopatra's children echoing in the gardens, now it was cloaked in a heavy silence. Every breath Cleopatra took seemed to reverberate in the oppressive stillness, as if even the walls were holding their breath, waiting for the inevitable. Octavian's legions had arrived at Egypt's borders, and with them came the cold, unrelenting grip of fate. Cleopatra sat in her private chambers, her eyes fixed on the golden asp that coiled itself in the corner of the room. Its sleek, scaled body moved slowly, its head bobbing ever so slightly as it regarded her with beady, unblinking eyes. The asp had always been a symbol of power in Egypt, of both life and death, of the pharaoh's divine connection to the gods. But today, as Cleopatra watched the serpent, she saw not divinity, but the dark promise of escape. Her heart raced, though outwardly she remained composed. Cleopatra had always been a master of her emotions, but even now, the fear that gnawed at her chest was impossible to suppress. Octavian had made his intentions clear. He would take her alive. He would march her through the streets of Rome as a trophy of his victory, parading her before the masses as a symbol of Egypt's fall. The very thought filled Cleopatra with dread. She who had ruled as a goddess, a queen who had stood against the might of Rome, would be humiliated, stripped of her power, her dignity, her very identity. She could not allow that. In the days since Antony's death, his life ended by his own hand in a fit of despair and betrayal, Cleopatra had spiraled into an introspective abyss. Antony's passing had left her more alone than she had ever imagined possible. For all his flaws, for all the defeats they had suffered together, he had been her partner in this dark dance of ambition and power. Now he was gone, and with him, the last of her hopes for a future free of Rome's shadow. She had made her peace with Antony's death, but her own fate weighed heavily on her mind. Octavian had sent messengers offering her terms of surrender. If she came quietly, he promised to spare her life. But Cleopatra knew that the life Octavian offered would be one of chains, not of freedom. She had heard of how he had treated other conquered rulers, stripping them of their titles and reducing them to mere relics of their former selves, caged for public amusement. The idea of living out her days as a prisoner, a broken queen in a foreign land, was more than she could bear. Cleopatra turned her gaze away from the asp, her thoughts drifting to the past. She thought of her youth, of the days when the palace had been filled with the laughter of her siblings, of the early days of her reign when she had believed herself invincible. She had been a ruler, a strategist, a queen of unmatched ambition. She had used her intellect and beauty to forge alliances with the most powerful men in the world, from Julius Caesar to Mark Antony, always positioning herself to secure Egypt's future. But now, those days felt distant, as if they belonged to someone else entirely. The reality of her situation pressed down on her like a weight. Octavian would arrive in Alexandria soon, and when he did, her choices would be stripped from her. He would imprison her, humiliate her, parade her through Rome as a defeated queen. Cleopatra could not allow herself to become his trophy, to be remembered as a victim, broken and conquered. Her pride would not permit it. No, Cleopatra thought, she would choose her own ending. The idea had first taken root when the news of Octavian's imminent arrival reached the palace. Cleopatra had spent days contemplating her options, weighing her desire to live against the grim reality of what that life would be. There had been moments of doubt, flashes of terror in the quiet hours of the night when she imagined the cold sting of the asp's bite, the slow creep of its venom through her veins. But those moments passed, and in their wake came clarity. If she could not live as a queen, she would die as one. The asp slithered closer, its movements slow and deliberate. Cleopatra rose from her chair and crossed the room, her steps graceful and measured despite the turmoil roiling inside her. She knelt before the small basket that housed the serpent, her fingers brushing against the cool fabric. In that moment, the decision crystallized in her mind, solid and unshakable. Death was not defeat. Death was freedom. Cleopatra summoned her most trusted servants, and as they entered the room, they found their queen draped in her finest robes, her dark hair braided and adorned with jewels. Her face, usually a mask of imperious authority, was softened by a strange, serene calm. She instructed them to bring her a meal, wine, and the basket with the asp inside. Her voice was steady, her commands clear. There was no hesitation in her words, no trace of fear. As her servants prepared the chamber, Cleopatra's thoughts turned to her children. Her son Caesarion, the child of Julius Caesar, had already been sent away, hidden from Octavian's reach in a last-ditch effort to preserve the royal bloodline. Cleopatra prayed that he would survive, though she knew the odds were slim. Octavian would not allow any threat to his power to live, and Caesarion's very existence was a reminder of the legacy that threatened Octavian's claim to Rome. Still, she held on to a small glimmer of hope that he might escape. When the room was ready, Cleopatra dismissed her servants, thanking them softly. They left her in silence, their expressions heavy with sorrow. They knew, as she did, that this was the end. Alone once more, Cleopatra took a seat, her back straight, her eyes fixed on the serpent that would soon deliver her from her fate. The asp was brought to her in its basket, its deadly form hidden beneath the folds of linen. Cleopatra's hands trembled only slightly as she reached for it, lifting the serpent into her lap. The creature hissed softly, its forked tongue flicking against her skin. Cleopatra gazed down at it, her heart steady, her mind clear. In this serpent, she saw not only death, but a final act of defiance, a refusal to bow to Octavian's will, to be reduced to a pawn in his triumph. In the dim light of her chambers, Cleopatra raised the asp to her breast. The bite, when it came, was swift and sharp. She felt the fangs pierce her flesh, the venom surging into her bloodstream like liquid fire. Her breath caught in her throat, and for a moment, panic gripped her. But as the poison spread, her fear melted away, replaced by an overwhelming sense of peace. She lay back against the cushions, her vision blurring as the world began to fade. The serpent slithered away, its task complete, leaving Cleopatra to face the final moments of her life alone. She felt the coolness of death creeping over her, numbing her body, quieting her thoughts. But there was no pain, only a deep, unshakable calm. As her heartbeat slowed, Cleopatra's mind drifted to the Nile, to the river that had given Egypt life for millennia. She thought of the great queens who had come before her, the women who had ruled with strength and grace. She thought of her reign, of the battles fought, the victories won, and the love she had known. In her final moments, Cleopatra felt the weight of her legacy settle over her like a shroud. But it was not a burden. It was a triumph. She had chosen her own fate, taken control of her destiny one last time. Cleopatra, the Queen of Egypt, had died on her own terms, as she had lived. The serpent's bite had sealed her fate, but it was Cleopatra's will that had set her free. Chapter 8. Legacy of the Dead Queen. The sun rose slowly over Alexandria, casting a soft, golden light over the palace where Cleopatra's life had ended. The city, once the heart of a great kingdom, was now quiet, as though holding its breath in mourning for the queen who had ruled with such strength and grace. Cleopatra's body, cold and still, lay in the grand chambers where she had met her final fate. But as the queen's lifeless form was prepared for burial, the true story of Cleopatra's legacy was only just beginning. News of Cleopatra's death spread quickly through Egypt, carried by whispers and rumors that grew with each telling. Some spoke of the queen's defiant end, of how she had chosen to die by her own hand, rather than face the humiliation of capture. Others spoke of the asp, the deadly serpent that had become a symbol not only of her death, but of her power. And still others whispered of betrayal, of how Cleopatra had been abandoned by Antony, by Rome, by the gods themselves. But beyond Egypt's borders, far across the sea in Rome, Cleopatra's legacy began to take on a different shape. Octavian, now the undisputed ruler of Rome, wasted no time in shaping the narrative to suit his victory. Cleopatra, once the queen of an ancient and powerful kingdom, was reduced to a villain, a temptress who had led noble men like Julius Caesar and Mark Antony astray. In the Roman imagination, Cleopatra became not the proud ruler who had fought to preserve her kingdom, but the seductress who had threatened the stability of the empire. To Octavian, Cleopatra's death was a triumph. With her gone, Egypt was his, and with Egypt came control of its wealth, its grain, and its position as a gateway to the east. But even as he paraded his victory through the streets of Rome, Cleopatra's shadow loomed over him. She had become more than just a queen. She was a symbol of defiance, a figure who refused to bow to the power of Rome, even in death. Yet for all the efforts to tarnish her name, to portray her as a villain, Cleopatra's legacy was far more complicated than the stories told by her conquerors. In Egypt, she was remembered as a fierce protector of her kingdom, a ruler who had fought against overwhelming odds to preserve her people's independence. She had been more than just a queen. She had been a living goddess, the embodiment of Egypt's strength and resilience in the face of Roman aggression. As the years passed, the line between truth and legend began to blur. Stories of Cleopatra's beauty, her intelligence, and her cunning spread across the ancient world, carried by merchants and travelers who spoke of the queen who had once held the fate of empires in her hands. Some said she had been a sorceress, capable of bending the will of the most powerful men in the world. Others claimed she had been the last true pharaoh of Egypt, a ruler who had fought to keep the gods of old alive in a world that was rapidly changing. But perhaps the most enduring myth was the one surrounding her death. The image of Cleopatra, lying in her royal robes, the asp coiled at her breast, became a symbol of both power and tragedy. The serpent, a creature associated with both life and death in Egyptian mythology, came to represent Cleopatra's final act of defiance. She had chosen her own end, embracing death as a queen rather than living as a prisoner. For centuries, poets, playwrights, and historians would be captivated by Cleopatra's story. In the works of Roman historians, she was often portrayed as a femme fatale, a woman whose ambition and beauty had led to the downfall of great men. But in the eyes of others, she was a tragic figure, a ruler who had been caught between the ambitions of two great empires and had paid the ultimate price for her defiance. The truth, as always, lay somewhere in between. Cleopatra had been both a victim and a villain, a queen and a woman driven by ambition and necessity. She had used her intelligence and charm to survive in a world dominated by men, forging alliances with Caesar and Antony not out of love, but out of a desire to protect her kingdom. But in the end, even her brilliance could not save her from the relentless march of Roman power. Cleopatra's death marked the end of an era. With her passing, Egypt was absorbed into the Roman Empire, its pharaohs gone, its gods reduced to relics of the past. The Nile, once the lifeblood of a great civilization, now flowed under the control of foreign rulers, its waters no longer the domain of a queen who had once been worshipped as a goddess. But Cleopatra herself did not fade into obscurity. Her name lived on, her story retold and reimagined by generations who were fascinated by the queen who had dared to challenge the might of Rome. In her defiance, in her tragic end, Cleopatra had become immortal, her legacy etched into the fabric of history. In the centuries that followed, Cleopatra's image would be shaped and reshaped to fit the needs of the times. In the Middle Ages, she was seen as a figure of sin, a woman whose seduction had led to the downfall of noble men. In the Renaissance, she was revered as a tragic heroine, a queen who had been caught in the tides of history, and had made the ultimate sacrifice. In modern times, Cleopatra has become a symbol of feminine power, a ruler who commanded the attention of the world through her intelligence, charm, and strength. But no matter how her story was told, one truth remained constant. Cleopatra was a woman who had refused to be forgotten. She had fought to protect her kingdom, to maintain her independence in the face of overwhelming odds, and in doing so, she had secured her place in history. Cleopatra had not only ruled as a queen, she had transcended the limits of mortality to become a legend. In the end, Cleopatra's legacy was more than just the story of her reign or her tragic death. It was the story of a woman who had challenged the greatest empire the world had ever known, who had refused to be defined by the men around her, and who, even in defeat, had chosen to control her own fate. The myths and legends that grew around her were a testament to her power, not just as a queen, but as a symbol of defiance, ambition, and the eternal struggle for freedom. As the centuries passed, the world would change, empires would rise and fall, but Cleopatra's name would endure. She had become more than a queen, more than a ruler. She had become an icon of power, of tragedy, and of the undying will to shape one's own destiny. The dead queen, her body long since returned to the earth, had achieved something greater than any empire: immortality. And so, as Cleopatra held the asp to her breast, it wasn't just fear or desperation that drove her, but the unyielding desire to control her fate, even in the face of impossible odds. She refused to be a mere trophy for Rome. Cleopatra's death was her final defiant act of power, ensuring that she would be remembered not as a defeated queen, but as an immortal legend. If you were captivated by this tale of ambition, betrayal, and tragedy, be sure to subscribe to Spellbound Stories, and come back every Thursday, where we explore the stories that continue to haunt history. Remember, legends never die.